Good Thursday morning, everyone, and welcome into today's daily Bible reading for Thursday. Today is February the 16th, and today we're reading together in Exodus chapter 2. Appreciate so much you tuning in for today's reading. Let me get the text of Exodus 2 up on the screen for us, and we'll continue reading about the difficulties of God's people as they find themselves in Egypt. Remember, it was by God's providence, in keeping with his promises that he had made to Father Abraham, and that he had reaffirmed with Isaac and Jacob, that their people would be preserved in such a way that they would be able to thrive and become strong, and then to be able to go into a great land that God would prepare for them. We're at this stage at this point where they have become a strong nation. And yet, as they have become the strong nation, now those that those whose land in which they have become afraid of them. Pharaoh, a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph or his God or everything that he had done for Egypt, he sees the Jews as a threat. And in doing so, we read in chapter 1 yesterday that he imposed a great deal of hard labor upon them. Whenever that didn't quell them, he decided to put the male children to death on the birth stool. Whenever that didn't work, he says, okay, we're just going to be throwing all the Hebrew male children into the river then at this point. So he's going to take this great vessel of life, which was the Nile River, and turn it into a grave in many ways, and use it to destroy God's people and to try to quell their numbers, so that in his mind they won't be so strong and there won't be the fear of them taking the side of any invading armies that might come against Egypt. So reading here then in Exodus chapter 2, we're going to see one specific family, a family of the tribe of Levi, who has a male child. And we're going to see that they, in some sense of the word, they do as Pharaoh says, but not really. They circumvent what Pharaoh says, and this child ends up being the one who's going to be a great deliverer for God's people. So reading together here in Exodus chapter 2, in verse number 1, now a man from the family of Levi married a Levite woman. The woman became pregnant and gave birth to a son. And when she saw that he was beautiful, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could no longer hide him, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with asphalt and pitch. She placed the child in it and set it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. Then his sister stood at a distance in order to see what would happen to him. Pharaoh's daughter went down to bathe at the Nile while her servant girls walked along the river bank. She saw the basket among the reeds. She sent her slave girl, took it, opened it, and saw him, the child. And there he was, a little boy crying. She felt sorry for him and said, this is one of the Hebrew boys. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, should I go and call a Hebrew woman who is nursing to nurse the boy for you? Go, Pharaoh's daughter told her. So the girl went and called the boy's mother. And then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child and nurse him for me, and I will pay your wages. So the woman took the boy and nursed him. When the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, because she said, I drew him out of the water. Years later, after Moses had grown up, he went out to his own people and observed their forced labor. He saw an Egyptian striking a Hebrew, one of his people. Looking all around and seeing no one, he struck the Egyptian dead and hid him in the sand. The next day, he went out and saw 2 Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, why are you attacking your neighbor? Or why are you attacking your fellow Hebrew? The man replied, who made you a commander and judge over us? Are you planning to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? Then Moses became afraid and thought, what I did is certainly known. When Pharaoh heard about this, he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in the land of Midian and sat down by a well. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters that came to draw water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. And then some shepherds arrived and drove them away, but Moses came to their rescue and watered their flock. When they returned to their father Reuel, he asked, "Why have you come back so quickly today?" They answered, "An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock." "So where is he?" he asked his daughters. Why did you leave the man behind? Invite him to eat dinner." Moses agreed to stay with the man, and he gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses in marriage. She gave birth to a son, whom he named Gershom, for he said, "I have been a resident alien in a foreign land." After a long time, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned because of their difficult labor. They cried out, and their cry for help because of the difficult labor ascended to God. God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God saw the Israelites, and God knew. That is Genesis chapter 2. Alrighty, thinking about the text that we see here in Genesis chapter 2, again, we are reading this on the heels of the edict that the young male children of the Jews are to be thrown into the river. There is this one family who is of the tribe of Levi, who, of course, is going to end up becoming the priestly line within the family of, or within the nation of Israel. They gave birth to a son, and the text says that he was beautiful. I think this echoes what we see in Genesis chapter 1, that in God's creating of the world, he saw that it was good. Well, in this creation of this boy, they saw that he also was good. He was beautiful, or he was healthy, and they just could not bring themselves to kill this child. They hide him for 3 months. And as I was reading, I saw some who, John Calvin being one, who really chastised the parents here for not just holding on to it and doing everything possible. He chastised them for putting him eventually in the river. And yet, as we read in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 23, the text tells us there that he was hid in faith, that the parents had faith that God would take care of this boy. And of course, God's providence does end up taking care of this boy as Moses is put into, what's interesting here is he's put into a papyrus basket. But I believe that this word is either a similar word or the same word that we get for ark, that this was a vessel through which life would be preserved. Here is an echo from the Genesis 6, 7, and 8 story of Noah and the flood, that his sister follows him along the bank, and eventually he is found by Pharaoh's daughters and her handmaidens. And it just so happens, it was God. God provided this opportunity for his sister to be there so that she could suggest to Pharaoh's daughter, "Hey, let me find a woman who is nursing to nurse him for you." So whenever all this is said and done, it is the faith of his parents, the faith of their names are going to be Amram and Jochebed. We're going to learn their names later on in the Exodus text. It is by their faith that Moses is delivered here in this moment. And I want to note too that whenever he is found, the text says that he was just a little boy. He was crying. This is going to foreshadow the crying out of Israel that we're going to see at the end of this chapter. Moses, in many ways, is the personification of Israel in this moment, that they are afflicted, they are needy, and they cry out to God. And that's what Moses here is doing in this text. So again, thankfully, Jochebed is able to nurse Moses herself. And she nursed him. When the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and she adopted him as her son. He became, in many senses, a son of Egypt. And he's able to do so because she's the one who saved him. She's the one who adopts him here in this moment. His name is Moses because I drew him out of the water. I have a footnote that says that this sounds like drawing out in Hebrew and the word born in Egyptian. So that is the meaning behind his name. Years later, we're told in the text in verse number 11, but Acts chapter 7 and verse 23 tells us this was 40 years later. 40 years later, when Moses had grown up, he'd become a man. He goes out and he sees the oppression of his people. It seems that he is very much he identifies himself with the Jewish people. He sees them as his people. And we know this because whenever he sees an Egyptian who was mistreating one of the Hebrew people, one of his people, the text tells us that one of his people identifies the Israelite as his person, as part of his people. He looks around because, again, he knows he's not supposed to do this, but he strikes down the Egyptian, he kills the Egyptian, and he hides him in the sand. This is the first instance where we see Moses being a rescuer, being a deliverer, being a redeemer of some sort. So he hides him. And then the text says the next day he saw two Hebrews fighting again. He tries to reconcile them and redeem them and encourage them. Don't fight amongst yourselves. There's no reason for you to do that. Well, whatever, they make a snide mark against him and say, oh, are you going to kill us like you killed the Egyptian? Whenever that comes to his knowledge, he says, oh no, we're in trouble. So he has to try to take off because Pharaoh also finds out about what he has done, and he has to flee. So he flees. Pharaoh tries to kill Moses. Moses has to flee, and he ends up going to the land of Midian, and he sits down by a well, which immediately should bring to our mind that, hey, somebody's probably about to get married, because how often have we seen in the story so far that marriage is preceded by a well? Abraham's servant finding a wife for Isaac at a well, Jacob himself finding a wife at a well. We should know that that's coming by now. One of the other things to note, though, is that this land of Midian is a family relative of the Israelites. This would have been the descendants of one of Abraham's, I believe that the wife of Abraham, Keturah, that this would have been some of their descendants. Well, here we end up running into a gentleman, or we run into the daughters of a gentleman. He is described as a priest of Midian. His name is Reuel, or we're going to see his name is Jethro later on. I think Reuel would have been more of a family name that this man would have had. And as these 7 daughters come, they are getting water in order to water the father's flock. Again, we're at a well, and some shepherds come and they try to run off the women, be mean to them, tell them this is our well. But Moses steps up again. This is the second time now, or the third time now, we see him being a rescuer. He just has that mindset. He is someone who tries to help those who are in a bad spot. And in doing so, he runs off the shepherds. He provides a safe place for these women to get their water. They return back to Reuel, to their father. And he's like, hey, that didn't take very long, because presumably it would have taken longer for them to do this on their own than for a man like Moses, a strong man, to be able to step up and do this work for them. And they say, well, an Egyptian, because Moses at this point would be very much an Egyptian. Again, he was raised in the house of Pharaoh. Though he identified in his mind with his Hebrew brothers and sisters, he in many senses would have looked just like an Egyptian and presented as an Egyptian. So in doing this, they say, well, an Egyptian, he's the one who saved us. And they say, and Reuel says, well, why did you leave him out there? He saved you. Tell him to come in and we're going to eat with him. So whenever they do that, Moses ends up agreeing to stay with this man, and his daughter Zipporah, Reuel's daughter, Jethro's daughter Zipporah, is given to Moses as a wife. And they end up having a son together. His name is Gershom. And he says, I have been a resident alien in a foreign land. This is Moses' feeling. Moses is feeling like this, that he has been, in many senses, not with his people. Growing up in the Egyptian land, he was not among his people. He was separate from them. Being here in Midian, he's not with his people. He is separate from them. And so this name then stems from that particular feeling that he's having. In verse 23, it tells us that the king of Egypt died. That the king of Egypt dies at this point, and upon his death, the Israelites groaned because of their difficult labor. They cried out, and their cry for help because of the difficult labor ascended to God. So they groaned, they cry out, and says they cry for help. They express to God that they need him, that they are in a bad position on their own. And God responds by hearing their groaning. He remembers his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And then God saw the Israelites, and God knew. God was going to see them, and he remembered this covenant that he had made with them, and now it's time for him to act upon the covenants. They had been where they needed to be for the time that they were supposed to be there. Remember, going back, I believe it's to Genesis chapter 15, your family is going to be in a foreign land for 400 years, and it's there that they're going to grow into this great nation. Well, now that's happened, but now it's time for the deliverance, and we've seen someone who seems to be a deliverer step up on the scene. He's a rescuer. He comes to the aid of other people. Is he going to be the one to deliver God's nation out of Egypt? We're going to see that as we continue on throughout this text. Again, here at the end of the chapter, we can't help but be impressed by God's faithfulness to hear his people, that God did not just send Israel down to Egypt and say, good luck, hope things go well with you. I'll be waiting up here in Canaan for you. No, he doesn't say that. No, he puts them down there by his providence. He provides for them. But now, as they are recognizing that this land is not our home, we are not where we should be, they cry out to the Lord. Again, there's groaning, there's crying out, there's cries for help, and they ascend to God. Who are they crying to? They're crying out to Yahweh. They're crying out to God, and God, being the loving God that he is, being the faithful God that he is, he does hear them. He does remember and know his covenants, and he's willing to act upon that. Now, we're going to see that specifically in chapter 3 and verse number 7, just so happens that in my Bible, chapter 2 and verses 23 through 25 are at the bottom of the page, and directly across from that is chapter 3 and verse number 7, which is the fulfillment of what we see in chapter 2 and verses 23 through 25. We'll talk about that connection some more tomorrow, but just again, let us continue to be impressed by God's faithfulness, by his faithfulness in creating this nation and helping this nation to thrive and become a mighty nation, so that he might bring them out of this land and put them in the promised land, in the land of milk and honey that he promised to their forefathers that they could continue to grow in and continue to maintain themselves, so that one day the promised seed would come through them. Appreciate so much you tuning in for this reading on this Thursday. We'll be back at it again tomorrow, reading together from Exodus chapter 3, which is the story of Moses being by the well, or excuse me, that was this chapter. Chapter 3 is Moses and the burning bush. He's a shepherd for his father Jethro, and we're going to see his interaction with God, and we're going to see a theophany, an appearance of God taking place within this chapter. I'm really excited to read that with you tomorrow, and hope you'll be able to tune in then. Take care, and God bless.